There we are. Yes, indeed. Well, we've done a few 3D scans of it and all sorts of stuff. This is a live feed, by the way, so you can see my hand here. Hello. And you can see we've got a lovely impression that's in this brick. Okay, now give it some perspective. This is a Babylonian brick. The history of it is quite interesting. It was collected in the 1930s by the Reverend Leonard Pearson, back when it was perfectly legal to go and pick up random things from Iraq and bring them back to England, seeing as it was still part of the British Empire. But we've got this rather brilliant and detailed inscription. Now, the great thing about this is that it was actually donated to the British Museum on loan for a number of years until about 1970, when Leonard Pearson took it back into his private collection, and there it basically stayed in his estate until we were able to then acquire it. So it's got a long and varied history, but while it was actually in the British Museum, it did end up getting translated. So you can see the inscription here, and actually here is the British Museum's translation of it. So if we get up nice and close so you can actually see what we're dealing with here. There's the British Museum details, right? You can see the room of writing. Now, as we go down, you can see we've got two lines of text. We have this line of text at the top here, the squiggly wiggly bits, and then we have some English letters. Now, the top line is the actual inscription copied out. The line below that, the English letters, is the transliteration. The transliteration is literally the Akkadian language, because this is cuneiform, right, which is the written version of the Akkadian language put into English letters. And it doesn't make much sense. I mean, you could try pronounce some of this. Nabu, Kudu, well, it doesn't really make much sense at all. But that's okay, because as we go down the page, you can see that we're now actually getting to the translation. Now, not only is it in British or English writing, English letters, but it actually makes some sense. It is actually translated. What does it say? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who provides for Esquila and Izida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, am I. Now, this am I, and you can see it's actually referenced here in the British Museum. This last phrase, am I, is omitted from many of the bricks. This little am I bit here is actually very, very important. Why is that the case? Well, what you'll find is that for many, many years, various scholars, biblical scholars, really claimed that there's no way that the book of Daniel could have been written at the time that it was supposed to have been written, simply because, and let me just come back here to me now so you can see me, simply because it refers to King Nebuchadnezzar in the first person. Let me give you an example of this, because we'll pull up a Bible verse here and just run through some of the details that we're talking about. So in Daniel chapter 4, you'll find it talks about the prayer of Nebuchadnezzar. Bit of historical context, Nebuchadnezzar comes out and boasts that he is the greatest king of all time, and to be fair, he probably was. But he goes one step further than that. He claims that he is a supreme God, and the one true God, the God of Israel, the Holy One of Israel, as it's referred to in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, he says, no, you're not the greatest God of all time, or the greatest king. You're going to go a bit mad, and your hair's going to grow out, and your fingernails are going to grow out, and you're going to go out and eat grass. And, Nebuchadnezzar went a bit wild, a bit mad. The madness of Nebuchadnezzar, as it became known as. By the end of that experience, Nebuchadnezzar said, you know what, I might not be the greatest God of all time. There's a much greater one even than I. And he recorded the prayer of Nebuchadnezzar, which is recorded in Daniel chapter 4. Look at what it says in Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of heavens, because all his works are truth and his ways are just, and because he is able to humiliate those who are walking in pride. Interesting words from a pagan king, but then if you had gone through the same experience that Nebuchadnezzar had been through, I suspect you might say something similar. However, notice how it's written in the first person. We're getting into some of the interesting things with English language here, right? Now I, this is the king speaking. I, Nebuchadnezzar, I am. Now, for many years, biblical scholars said there's no way that this could have been written at the time that it was supposed to have been written, because no scribe would dare write down the words, I, Nebuchadnezzar, it would be blasphemy. It'd be a bit like me going, I, God, say this. No, the one true God says it. And so really what they said is that you can't trust the Bible. Then a little while later, they started discovering things like this Babylonian brick, which does refer to the king in the first person. Interesting piece of evidence. It turns out that the scholars were half right. Scribes wouldn't write down, I am Nebuchadnezzar. So whenever you see reference to the first person, to King Nebuchadnezzar, or any of the Babylonian kings, you'll find that it's the king himself who wrote it. It's the king himself who actually stamped it. So number one, you can trust the Bible. This is an accurate record of what the king actually declared himself and stamped and wrote down, just like he stamped and wrote down our foundation brick. The I am is very significant, and even the British Museum recognize this because the king's signatures are rarely signed with such a double confirmation that it was actually the king himself who authorized this statement. So it's now an excellent piece of evidence that the biblical book of Daniel, where King Nebuchadnezzar wrote the official tablet stating, I am King Nebuchadnezzar, and I say this, the King of heaven is greater than I. So interesting piece of biblical evidence. Interesting importance that the archaeological evidence really does confirm that the biblical record is consistent and the Bible can be trusted. Now, this is all amazing, and we've spoken about this a number of times before, but John, I'm going to go back to you now, because what on earth has this got to do with the Australian Aboriginals?